So the state of Texas, along with many states, currently have no rent control policies in place, but there is a growing sentiment that that should change. We're talking all about that today. Let's get started. So today I'm going to address a documentary in which the topic of rent control was raised, and to some degree, both sides of the issue as presented in this documentary. Why are so many people calling for rent control, and what responsibilities do landlords have in this debate?
The rent! The rent! The rent is too damn high!
The housing market is a catastrophe.
Record rental prices across the United States.
And something's gotta give.
Living in America is freaking ridiculous right now.
I can't afford any of these apartments.
$1,800 for a one-bedroom apartment.
$1,400 for 485 square feet.
I guess I just live in my truck.
So what these people are describing are market realities. It's not just rent that's high. Everything's a little bit higher these days. The question is, are rents so high that nobody's able to pay that rent? I think the data shows otherwise. In fact, the data seems to show that plenty of people are finding housing. They're maybe just not finding the kind of housing that they feel entitled to. So now people are calling on the federal government to step in, but the federal government doesn't always make things better. Sometimes they'll make sweeping changes that actually cause harm instead of just alleviating harm. For the billions of dollars that were reserved for the COVID-19 pandemic, it seems that much of the money went not to the deserving poor, but to people who were clever enough to game the system.
Over a third of Americans are renters, and if you're in that category, you probably don't need to be told that the rental market is out of control. The question is, can anything actually be done about it? A historic wave of tenant organizing, unlike anything we've seen in decades, has found one answer: national rent control.
The tenant movement is absolutely within striking distance of rent regulation at the national level.
So it's clear that tenants are beginning to organize, and they're showing their frustrations with the current market realities. But the truth is that the rising cost of rent is not directly connected to the rising level of landlord greed. It's a perception that the reason that rents are so high is because landlords themselves are, as a collective, a greedy group of individuals whose only interest is collecting more and more money from their tenants. That landlords somehow use the rent as an oppressive mechanism to hoard property and to charge maximum rates in order to make maximum profits. Now, the truth is there are some bad landlords out there, and you'll hear it from me. I have no problem with people organizing and people using the courts in a way to address bad landlording. It's one of the reasons that I'm here, is to show landlords a better and legal way of doing things. And certainly not all landlords are going to heed my advice. But to presume that landlords get the law wrong intentionally as opposed to just because they don't know, I don't know that really things should go that far. Many landlords do everything they can to follow the law and do whatever they can to accommodate their tenants within reason. But that's not always the case.
So me and my neighbor, my best friend down the hall from me, we just said one day, she was like, let's call KC Tenants. And I said, okay. So I called and I left a message on the hotline, and a couple of days later, I got a phone call back.
A group called KC Tenants were fighting to stop eviction hearings at the Jackson County Courthouse.
Evictions will kill people like me.
Charged crowd packed City Hall for more than 3 hours. The yellow shirts in the room are tenants, each with their own personal story.
In a national housing crisis where rent inflation has vastly outpaced income growth, groups like KC Tenants have given their members power to take on their landlords.
We have written and passed a tenant's bill of rights. We've won free lawyers for every tenant facing eviction. We've organized buildings and neighborhoods. And just recently, we elected 4 members of city council.
And that movement seems to be growing.
Places like Louisville, Kentucky, Bozeman, Montana, Cape Girardeau, Missouri.
The current surge in tenant organizing is the most significant since the 1970s. And it's allowing renters to fight for the kind of big relief that only the federal government can enact.
Landlords, I know that you are receiving value out of today's video. If you enjoy what you see, please don't hesitate to give us a like. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. So I know that sensible legislation protecting tenants is actually a good thing for the market. We don't want bad landlords who prey on the most vulnerable citizens, taking advantage of people who are the least likely to have legal representation or the least likely to stand up for themselves in the legal process. However, legislation should not be written as though every landlord is one thing. Certainly, the perception should not be that every landlord is some large conglomerate, some expansive multinational organization with billions of dollars in assets. That's just not the reality for most landlords. While many landlords who own significant pieces of property do fit that description, a vast majority of small landlords own so many single family and even some multifamily units, but don't own much more, certainly not in the billions of dollars. And so if you write legislation that attacks or treats all landlords exactly the same way, you're gonna find that fairness is not evenly distributed. Now, one argument in this documentary is that it's perfectly fair to have certain federal limitations when landlords are using federal funds, whether they have loans that are federally backed or whether they're accepting federal funds for their own tenants. And I agree. If someone is accepting federal funding, then yes, federal regulation is perfectly appropriate. But those same regulations shouldn't just apply to every landlord, particularly the majority of landlords who aren't receiving a nickel of that federal funding.
If rent control limits developers' potential for profit, they just won't build as much housing. There's no question we need to build way more housing. And there are vigorous debates among housing advocates about how to do that through policies like zoning reform and public financing. But all of those proposals would take years to have an impact on rents. And the fact remains, renters need relief now.
So let's talk about the concept of rent control and how it affects actual landlords. Presume for a moment that someone purchases property with the intent of leasing that property to tenants, but that the cost to maintain a particular property in terms of taxes and insurance and basic maintenance and upkeep of the structure itself require that for that venture to remain profitable, rents have to rise. If the landlord is unilaterally prohibited from raising rents to meet that market demand, what incentive does the landlord have to ever improve the real property? In fact, there's a disincentive when a landlord can only raise rents at an incremental rate. There's an absolute disincentive for rapid improvement or massive change to any given real estate project. The truth is, it comes down to dollars and cents. And if an investor or an individual landlord simply cannot yield a profit from the effort, it doesn't make sense that any of that effort will actually transpire. In fact, the only way that real property gets better is when someone's willing to risk money in order to make an improvement on the hopes that they'll be able to recover that investment from, in this case, rental income. If it turns out that the numbers simply don't make sense because rental income can only rise to a certain level, then any improvements that exceed that level simply will never happen. This ultimately will affect all property. If individual landlords can only raise rent to a certain extent each year, then the likelihood of year-to-year improvements on any real property is less likely. Additionally, when profitability goes down, that's when small-time landlords are lost. A landlord who has a handful of properties is likelier to have one-on-one contact with their tenant and likelier to address the needs of the property when a tenant makes a repair request, because that investment is their direct livelihood. Larger conglomerate owners have less of a personal stake in individual units and certainly make no personal connection to their tenants. The fewer individual landlords there are, the worse the landscape is for tenants. So you really have to ask yourself whether or not it makes any sense to have broad rent control that applies to all landlords across a given state and certainly across the United States.